picture this. A piercing scream shatters the stillness of a freezing January night in the year 1457. Inside the stone walls of Pembroke Castle, the torches flicker against tapestries as midwives rush to a chamber heavy with the scent of burning herbs. On a narrow bed lies Lady Margaret Beaufort, a girl of only 13, her frail frame twisted in agony as wave after wave of pain tears through her small body. She is no woman. She is still a child, her bones not yet grown, her voice breaking into desperate cries that echo down the cold corridors. Yet within her womb, destiny is being forced into the world. The women gathered around her exchange grave looks. They know the truth. Her hips are too narrow, her body too fragile. This labor could end in death for both mother and child. And yet this child must be born, for he is no ordinary infant. He is the boy who will one day wear England's crown, a boy whose survival will alter the course of history and end the Wars of the Roses. Outside, the sea crashes endlessly against the Welsh cliffs. Inside, Margaret clutches bloodied sheets, her knuckles white, whispering prayers between sobs. Every scream, every tear, is a sacrifice made at the altar of power. And as dawn approaches, history prepares to turn on the broken body of a girl who was never given a childhood, yet was destined to become the mother of a dynasty. The story of Lady Margaret Beaufort begins not in the pain of childbirth, but in the delicate, uncertain balance of dynastic ambition and personal fragility that marked her earliest years. Born in May of 1443, in a world torn apart by the lingering shadows of the 100 Years' War, she entered life already burdened with expectation. Her father, John Beaufort, the first Duke of Somerset, was a man of noble blood and heavy responsibilities. Yet by the time Margaret could walk, his legacy was already tainted with whispers of failure, disgrace, and despair. He had commanded English armies in France during the waning years of England's dominance across the Channel. But where Henry V had triumphed, John faltered. Defeat after defeat gnawed at his spirit until he returned home, hollow-eyed and broken, a man whose shoulders bowed under the invisible weight of humiliation. By 1444, when Margaret was barely a year old, he was found dead, the official explanation being fever. But courtiers whispered what no chronicler dared to write too boldly, that he had taken his own life to escape the dishonor of defeat. Whether by poison, by blade, or simply by despair, his end marked the beginning of Margaret's lifelong education in the cruelty of politics. Her earliest memory, though unformed, was of absence. A father lost, a family shadowed by shame, and a mother forced into the cold calculations of survival. Her mother, Margaret Beauchamp of Bletsoe, was no passive widow, but a woman who understood with brutal clarity that in 15th century England, a child's life was not her own. In that savage landscape of shifting loyalties and unending rivalries, a young girl with royal blood was not seen as an innocent to be cherished, but as a pawn to be played, an instrument through which power might be gained or secured. Margaret Beaufort, as fragile and small as she was, carried within her veins the blood of kings through John of Gaunt, son of Edward III. And that made her both invaluable and dangerously vulnerable. Her mother wasted no time in binding her child's future with promises. At the age of 6, long before she could truly grasp what marriage meant, Margaret was betrothed to John de la Pole, heir to the Duke of Suffolk. To modern ears, the thought is shocking, the binding of a child in such contracts. But in that era, it was the cold mathematics of survival. Families calculated wealth, alliances, and claims to power with precision, and young girls like Margaret were placed on the board like pieces in a deadly game of chess. To her, childhood was not filled with dolls or games, but with whispered conversations about inheritance, estates, and the fragile stability of a kingdom sliding toward chaos. But fate rarely respected the ink of contracts. When William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk, fell into disgrace and was brutally murdered on the high seas in 1450, the carefully woven plan for Margaret's future was reduced to ash. His head was hacked from his shoulders after clumsy blows by his captors, his fall sending shock waves through England's nobility. The betrothal of young Margaret, once a glittering alliance, became worthless parchment overnight. Here again, at just 7 years old, she was taught a cruel truth that would mark her life, that security in her world was an illusion, and that her body, her destiny, and her very survival would be perpetually subject to the storms of politics. She was a child in age, but already she was learning to harden herself in a way that few children should ever need to. It was not long before another match was arranged, this time with a name that would one day alter the very course of England's history: Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond. The Tudors were no ancient dynasty, no mighty line with centuries of legitimacy. They were, in truth, little more than Welsh upstarts, their claim to prominence resting on the scandalous union between Owen Tudor, a Welsh courtier, and Catherine of Valois, the widow of King Henry V. That marriage, born of passion and secrecy, had stunned the realm but produced sons who rose to favor at the court of Henry VI. Edmund, son of Owen and Catherine, was elevated to nobility and granted the earldom of Richmond. His blood carried no true royal weight, yet his proximity to the throne made him a man of consequence. For the Beauforts, and for Margaret's mother, such a connection meant renewed hope, an anchor in a time when the kingdom's political winds threatened to sweep them all away. Margaret was barely 12 when she was wed to Edmund in a ceremony that was more transaction than celebration. The tapestries of Bletsoe Castle bore silent witness as vows were spoken in words she barely understood, binding her to a man more than a decade older, a man who already bore the scars of war and the weight of political expectation. To Margaret, still slipping between childhood and adolescence, the marriage must have felt less like a union and more like a sentence. The very night it was consummated, her innocence was ended, her body forced into roles for which it was unready. Noble girls were seen not as children, but as vessels for heirs, their worth measured by the sons they could bring forth, regardless of whether their bodies were ready for such torment. In that chamber, under the weight of Edmund's duty and ambition, Margaret's fate was sealed, not as a child, not as a bride, but as a mother-in-waiting. In these early years, Margaret Beaufort's life was already defined by contradictions too sharp for a child to bear. She was both cherished and exploited, protected and endangered, her lineage both blessing and curse. Every step she took was dictated by others, her own desires irrelevant in a world where survival was dictated by bloodlines and loyalty. Yet within her, something was already forming, a quiet resilience, a sharpness of mind, a determination to find meaning in suffering. It was not joy that would shape her, but pain, not freedom, but confinement. And as England descended toward the bloody chaos of the Wars of the Roses, Margaret Beaufort, barely more than a child, stood unknowingly at the threshold of becoming one of the most significant figures of her age, not by choice, but by the ruthless will of history itself. The winter of 1456 was already tightening its icy grip on Wales when Margaret Beaufort, scarcely 13 years old and heavy with child, found herself staring into a future she could not fully understand. Her husband, Edmund Tudor, had gone to war, answering the endless summons of King Henry VI in the bitter struggle that was tearing England apart between the rival houses of Lancaster and York. His absence was not simply the absence of a husband. It was the absence of protection, for Margaret was left exposed, a child bride carrying within her the most precious and precarious hope of the Tudor line. Then, in the late months of that year, the news reached her. A messenger arriving soaked with rain, his horse lathered with exhaustion, bearing the tidings that Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond, had been captured at Carmarthen Castle. Days later, another message followed, reporting that Edmund had died in captivity, whether from plague as his captors claimed, or from betrayal and murder as many suspected. No one could say with certainty. What was certain was that Margaret, scarcely into her teenage years, was already a widow, her womb heavy with an heir she was far too young to deliver, her future bound to the child inside her, and to the dangerous storm of politics gathering around them. The burden of her protection fell to Edmund's younger brother, Jasper Tudor, a man barely into his mid-20s, but already seasoned by war and politics. Recognizing both the vulnerability and the significance of his sister-in-law, Jasper acted quickly, taking Margaret under his care and leading her to the bleak fortress of Pembroke Castle. Perched high upon a limestone outcrop where the river Pembroke flows into the sea, the castle stood like a sentinel against both man and nature, its round keep rising above the Welsh cliffs battered endlessly by the Atlantic winds. To Margaret, the journey there was no gentle passage but an ordeal. The roads were clogged with winter mud, rivers were swollen and dangerous, and every bend in the road held the possibility of armed men whose loyalty could not be trusted. She traveled in a litter drawn by horses, every jolt and rut in the frozen road sending pain shooting through her fragile, swollen body. For 5 days the journey stretched, her attendants whispering prayers as she grew paler and weaker, until at last they reached the cold refuge of Pembroke, where she would endure the most terrifying trial of her life. Life within the stone walls of the castle was harsh and unforgiving. The wind howled through the arrow slits, carrying with it the taste of salt and the bitter bite of the sea. Fires were kept burning in the great hearths, but the heat was never enough to chase away the chill that settled into one's bones. Margaret's chambers were hung with heavy tapestries, not for decoration, but to keep out the draughts that seeped through the ancient stones. Here, surrounded by servants, attendants, and the constant presence of Jasper, Margaret awaited the coming birth, her mind a whirl of fear, prayer, and unspoken dread. The physician, a learned man who had studied at Oxford and Paris, examined her with a troubled gaze, for he knew well what the midwives also suspected, that Margaret's body was not yet fully formed, her hips too narrow to deliver a child of such size, her youth a dangerous obstacle to survival. He confided his fears to Jasper in private, speaking in grave whispers of the likelihood that both mother and child might not survive the ordeal to come. Jasper, scarcely older than Margaret herself, bore the crushing weight of responsibility, knowing that the survival of his family's fragile dynasty rested upon the outcome of this single, perilous birth. In those long nights of waiting, Margaret sought refuge in prayer. The castle chapel became her sanctuary, its cold stone walls echoing with her whispered supplications to the Virgin and to the saints. She knelt for hours upon the hard floor, her knees rubbed raw, her lips moving in ceaseless petitions for the safety of the child within her and for the strength to endure what lay ahead. Her religiosity, which would come to define her character in later life, was already taking shape, forged in the crucible of fear and suffering. Some historians would later suggest that it was not mere piety, but desperation, a coping mechanism for a girl whose life had been torn from her hands, who had no other recourse but to bend her will entirely to God in the hope that submission might be exchanged for survival. Her attendants looked on with a mixture of awe and worry, for her intensity was unlike that of most young noblewomen. In the depth of her devotion, there was both holiness and a shadow of obsession, the spark of a woman who would learn to wield faith as both shield and sword. As the days grew shorter and the winds more merciless, the tension within Pembroke Castle became palpable. Servants moved quietly, speaking in hushed tones, aware that the fate of their young mistress was bound to the fate of the Tudor line itself. Jasper paced the corridors, his boots striking against the stone floors as he tried to master his anxiety, his ear ever alert to the sounds from Margaret's chamber. The physician prepared his instruments and potions, while the midwives gathered herbs, sharp knives, and relics of the saints, each object of fragile hope against the terror of what they might face. The women who attended Margaret, seasoned in childbirth, had seen such cases before. Children forced into motherhood, their bodies breaking under the strain of dynastic ambition. They knew the risk, and their eyes, when they met, carried the silent acknowledgement that this night could bring death as easily as life. And so the stage was set, the castle braced against the storm outside, while within its walls another storm prepared to break. Margaret Beaufort, a widow of 13, a child swollen with the heir to England's uncertain future, lay in her chamber surrounded by the flickering light of torches and the low murmur of prayers. Beyond the walls, the sea roared, the cliffs shuddered, and the winds howled as if nature itself bore witness to the cruelty unfolding in the heart of Pembroke. Every passing hour brought her closer to the trial that would define her life, and every whispered prayer carried with it the knowledge that survival was not promised. In the darkness of that Welsh fortress, history waited, holding its breath, as the future of a dynasty pressed mercilessly against the frail body of a girl who had never been allowed to be a child. When at last the first pangs of labor struck, they came not as a gentle warning but as an overwhelming force, tearing through Margaret's fragile body with a ferocity that left her doubled over in agony. It was the early hours of January 28, 1457, and the winds outside Pembroke Castle shrieked as if in unholy chorus with the cries that now echoed through the draughty chambers. Margaret had been walking along the battlements when the initial pain seized her, and her attendants rushed her back into her chamber, their faces drained of color as they exchanged fearful glances. The midwives, seasoned women who had delivered countless children, needed no words to express what they all knew, that this would be no ordinary birth. Here was a girl barely into her 13th year, her bones still forming, her pelvis far too narrow to accommodate the child pressing to enter the world. Yet history had placed its burden upon her shoulders, and whether her body was prepared or not, the child would come. With hurried hands, the women lit additional torches, spread clean linens, and laid out instruments that glinted coldly in the dim light. Some meant to deliver life, others prepared for grim necessity should death intervene. The labor stretched into hours that felt like lifetimes. Margaret's screams tore through the thick stone walls, her voice hoarse until it broke entirely into gasping sobs. Sweat soaked her hair and trickled into her eyes, mixing with tears she could no longer control. The chamber became a world of blood, smoke, and whispered prayers, the midwives moving tirelessly, applying poultices, pressing their hands against her belly, offering her herbal concoctions meant to dull pain or summon strength, though none could ease the torment. Outside the door, Jasper Tudor paced with the restlessness of a man who bore the fate of his family in silence, straining his ears to every muffled cry, every hurried footstep of servants carrying hot water or fresh linen. To him, each passing moment carried the weight of doom or deliverance. To the women inside, each cry of the girl was a knife edge between life and death. 18 hours passed in a blur of suffering that could scarcely be endured, yet Margaret endured it, her child's body fighting against the agony of womanhood imposed too soon. The midwives grew desperate, their faces lined with dread as they debated among themselves whether the girl could possibly survive. 1. Dame Gwen Furch-Daffod, a woman hardened by decades of birthing chambers, prepared for the most dangerous of interventions. She prayed silently to Saint Bray, Margaret of Antioch, patroness of childbirth, before positioning the child bride for a manual extraction, a maneuver that carried nearly certain risk of killing mother, child, or both. The air was thick with incense and the acrid tang of blood, the chamber a theater of suffering where even the most hardened attendants fought back tears. Margaret clutched the sheets until her fingernails tore, her lips moving in hoarse whispers of prayer, surrendering her life to God with each contraction that threatened to break her in two. And then, in a moment of excruciating terror, the chamber fell silent as the baby was pulled from her body, limp, pale, and still. For a heartbeat, all froze. The midwives bent urgently over the tiny form, clearing its mouth and chest, slapping its skin, willing it into life. The fire snapped in the hearth, torches hissed, Margaret's ragged breathing filled the room, and then, at last, a thin, piercing cry cut the silence. It was the cry of Henry Tudor, the boy who would one day wear England's crown, the fragile sound that carried with it the weight of a dynasty yet to be born. Margaret, barely conscious, her body shattered by the ordeal, turned her eyes toward the child, her lips parting in a faint, exhausted attempt at a smile. For a brief moment, mother and son were united, the future pressed against the battered chest of a girl who should still have been a child herself. Then the baby was swept away to be swaddled and warmed, leaving Margaret collapsed in bloodied sheets, her breath shallow, her body irreparably torn. The physicians and midwives who examined her in the hours and days that followed knew the truth. Though they spoke of it only in whispers, she had survived, but at a terrible cost. The tearing of her body, the damage to her internal organs, and the strain upon her young frame left her permanently injured. She would never again bear another child. At the very beginning of her womanhood, before her body had even fully formed, her ability to fulfill the one role demanded of noblewomen, that of bearing heirs, was cruelly and permanently ended. For Margaret, the physical wounds were accompanied by deep psychological scars. She would live, yes, and she would raise her son with a devotion bordering on fanaticism, but she would never escape the shadow of that night, never forget the agony that had nearly consumed her, nor the thin thread by which both her life and her son's had been preserved. The weeks that followed her confinement were a battle against death itself. Fever consumed her body, infection lingered in her wounds, and more than once the attendants feared she would not survive to see spring. She lay pale and weak, trembling with chills, unable to rise from her bed. Yet even as her flesh weakened, her spirit hardened. She spoke often with the priest of the castle, her prayers deepening into something fierce, almost militant. If God had spared her, she reasoned, it was not without purpose. Her son was destined for greatness, and she, broken though she was, would devote every breath of her life to securing his future. From the crucible of pain emerged not a victim, but the beginnings of a strategist, a mother who would turn her suffering into ambition. The girl who had nearly died in childbirth was being remade into a woman who would outlast kings. Thus, as the winds of war gathered strength across England and the roses of Lancaster and York prepared to drench the land in blood, Margaret Beaufort rose slowly from her sickbed, altered forever. Her body was scarred, her innocence destroyed, her youth consumed in a single catastrophic night. Yet she clung to her son as to a divine promise, cradling him with a mixture of tenderness and iron resolve. The child was her legacy, her revenge against the cruelty that had taken her childhood, her claim to power in a world that otherwise would have discarded her. Henry Tudor was not simply her son, he was her mission. And in the dim chambers of Pembroke Castle, as the waves crashed ceaselessly against the Welsh cliffs, the foundations of the Tudor dynasty were laid upon the blood and tears of a girl who had been forced to become a mother, before she had truly ceased to be a child. In the months and years that followed the harrowing birth of Henry Tudor, Margaret Beaufort found herself navigating a world that was unraveling into violence and uncertainty. England was descending into the bloody turmoil of the Wars of the Roses, and every noble family was forced to reckon with shifting allegiances, broken promises, and the ever-present threat of ruin. For Margaret, the survival of her son was all that mattered, for she knew instinctively that the fragile infant she had nearly died to bring into the world carried within him not only her hope, but also the destiny of the Lancastrian cause. Yet she was scarcely more than a child herself, a girl who had been broken in body and reshaped in spirit, and it was only through the guidance of others and her own growing sense of resilience that she began to carve out a place for herself in the brutal game of dynastic survival. With Edmund dead and her body still scarred from childbirth, she relied heavily on Jasper Tudor, her brother-in-law, who assumed guardianship of both her and her son. Jasper's protection was more than an act of familial duty. It was a recognition of the enormous political value the boy represented. In a time when the Lancastrian king Henry VI was faltering, when the kingdom's loyalty was splintering, and when the Yorkist cause was growing stronger, Henry Tudor became a beacon of possibility, and Margaret, even in her youth, recognized the peril and promise of that fact. Her devotion to religion intensified in these years, not as the gentle piety expected of a noblewoman, but as an all-consuming force that guided her every thought and decision. Long hours were spent in prayer, her lips moving feverishly in Latin as she begged God for the protection of her child and for the strength to endure what life demanded of her. Many attendants whispered that her faith bordered on obsession, but to Margaret it was the only structure in a world that had stripped her of control. She believed her suffering had been divinely ordained, that her survival in childbirth when so many predicted her death was no accident, but a sign that she had been chosen for a purpose greater than her own life. That belief hardened into a conviction that her son's destiny was tied to God's plan, and that she herself was merely the instrument by which it would be carried out. Her body may have been ruined, but her spirit was sharpening into a blade, one she would wield with careful calculation for the rest of her life. It was during this period that Margaret was pushed once more into the relentless cycle of marriages that defined the lives of noblewomen. In 1458, still recovering from the trauma of her first marriage and childbirth, she was wed to Sir Henry Stafford, the younger son of the Duke of Buckingham. This union was not born of affection but of political necessity, a marriage arranged to secure her estates, safeguard her son's inheritance, and align her with a man whose loyalties leaned toward the Yorkist cause. The ceremony was modest, stripped of grandeur, for England itself was seething with violence, and the time for elaborate displays had passed. To Margaret, the marriage was both a shield and a cage. Stafford was pragmatic, perhaps even kind in his own distant way, but he was not her choice, and his loyalties to York placed her in constant tension with her own blood ties to Lancaster. Yet she endured it, as she endured all things, quietly calculating how best to use her position for the protection of her son. The Wars of the Roses only deepened her resolve. Battles erupted across the land. St. Albans, Towton, Barnet fields drenched in the blood of thousands, as the white rose of York clashed with the red rose of Lancaster. Margaret was no warrior, no commander leading men into battle, but her influence was felt in quieter, more insidious ways. She forged networks of alliances, cultivated relationships with noble families, and learned the dangerous art of double loyalty, appearing to support York when necessary, while keeping her heart and her hopes tethered firmly to Lancaster. She understood with increasing clarity that her survival and her son's survival depended not on brute force but on subtlety, patience, and the careful weaving of connections that might one day be called upon when fortune shifted. Separation from her son became one of the greatest torments of her life. For his safety, Henry was kept in the custody of Jasper Tudor in Wales, far from the reach of Yorkist assassins and shifting tides of war. Margaret saw him rarely, sometimes only once in a year, and even then under guarded and precarious circumstances. Each parting was agony, her maternal instinct screaming against the necessity, but she forced herself to endure, knowing that distance was the only protection she could give him. Instead, she poured her love and longing into letters, some carefully coded to evade interception, filled with words of guidance, prayers, and fragments of wisdom meant to shape the boy into a man she hoped would one day claim his destiny. She sent small gifts when she could: books, garments, tokens of affection, each one carrying the weight of a mother's desperate need to remain present in the life of a son being raised without her. Her education in politics deepened alongside her personal grief. With Stafford, she learned to manage estates, oversee accounts, and navigate the delicate balances of power within a society where wealth and land were as dangerous as armies. She began to see patterns in the chaos, to recognize which nobles could be trusted, which were mere opportunists, and which held grudges that could topple dynasties. Every misstep could mean ruin, yet she honed her instincts with a precision that astonished those around her. She was no longer the terrified girl screaming in the birthing chamber. She was becoming a woman forged by fire, a strategist learning the rules of survival in a world that consumed the weak. By the early 1460s, England itself was unrecognizable. The Lancastrian king had been dethroned, Edward IV of York sat upon the throne, and Margaret's position had become ever more precarious. To be the mother of a Lancastrian heir was to live with a target painted across one's back, and she knew it. Yet rather than retreat into obscurity, she began laying the foundations of the networks and alliances that would, in time, raise her son from exile to kingship. Her faith remained her armor, her motherhood, her weapon, and her suffering her fuel. Where others might have surrendered to despair, she cultivated patience, teaching herself to wait, to endure, and to plan with a vision that stretched beyond the battles of the present into a future she believed was divinely promised. As the years turned and England's soil drank the blood of countless battles, Margaret Beaufort's life hardened into one of constant vigilance, her every action driven by the single purpose of securing her son's survival and eventual claim. By the 1470s, the Lancastrian cause seemed all but extinguished. Henry VI was a broken man, his queen exiled, and his only son, Edward of Westminster, slain on the battlefield at Tewkesbury. With the death of that young prince, the direct Lancastrian line was severed, and into that void, fragile and uncertain though it was, stepped Margaret's son. Barely a teenager, Henry Tudor was now, by blood, the last remaining thread upon which the hopes of a cause rested, and that made him both precious and perilous. Jasper Tudor spirited him into exile in Brittany, across the Channel, where the boy would spend 14 long years, growing into a man in a foreign court, while his mother, left behind in England, wove her plans with the patience of a spider spinning a web in the shadows of danger. For Margaret, those years of separation were agony, yet also a crucible in which her ambition sharpened into something unbreakable. Her second husband, Henry Stafford, had died in 1471, leaving her once again a widow but not unprotected. In time, she aligned herself with Thomas Stanley, one of the shrewdest and most calculating nobles of the realm, a man whose loyalties shifted with the winds of fortune but whose influence and power were undeniable. Their marriage was less about companionship than about survival and strategy. Stanley provided her with cover, wealth, and the kind of political shield that allowed her to continue her quiet conspiracies, while Margaret brought him legitimacy and access to networks of nobility tied by blood to the Lancastrian line. Together they endured the volatile reign of Edward IV, the sudden crisis of his death, and the ruthless ascent of Richard III, who seized the throne amid whispers of child murder and treachery. For Margaret, Richard's usurpation of power was not only a national calamity, but also a divine opening. His crown rested upon blood-stained ground, and his legitimacy was questioned from the first day of his reign. In such an atmosphere, her son's distant claim, once faint, began to gleam as a possible alternative. It was in these years that Margaret's reputation as both devout and dangerously ambitious crystallized. Though confined at times under suspicion, her will was never broken. Through coded letters, clandestine meetings, and careful manipulation of alliances, she conspired with Yorkist dissidents, disillusioned nobles, and foreign allies, laying the groundwork for the return of her son. Her faith burned as fiercely as ever, convincing her that God's hand guided these events and that Henry was destined to restore not only the Lancastrian cause, but also a peace to a land torn apart by decades of civil war. Every act of patience, every risk she took, was measured against the vision of that outcome. She was no longer simply the girl who had been forced into motherhood. She was the architect of a dynasty, moving with a cold determination that left even her enemies in awe. At last, in 1485, after decades of suffering, exile, and bloodshed, the moment arrived. Henry Tudor landed at Milford Haven with his small band of supporters, marching under the red dragon of Cadwallader, symbol of ancient Welsh prophecy. Margaret, watching events unfold from afar, knew that everything she had endured, every forced marriage, every separation, every tear had led to this fateful gamble. At Bosworth Field, on a muddy August day, Richard III clashed with Henry's forces in a battle that would decide the fate of the crown itself. In the chaos of combat, the Stanleys, her husband's family, whose loyalties had long remained carefully ambiguous, threw their weight behind Henry at the decisive moment, turning the tide. Richard was cut down, fighting bravely but doomed, his crown seized from the thorns of a hawthorn bush and placed upon Henry's head. The boy who had once cried his first breath in Margaret's bloody chamber, torn violently from her child body, now stood as Henry VII, King of England. The Wars of the Roses were ended, the Tudor dynasty was born, and Margaret's life's purpose had been fulfilled in full measure. Yet triumph did not erase the scars of her past. Margaret Beaufort became the most powerful woman in England, styled the King's Mother, a matriarch who wielded influence over court, church, and crown. But she never again enjoyed the simple bond of mother and child that had been stolen from her in youth. Henry had been raised apart, in exile and in fear, and though she loved him fiercely, their relationship was always tinged with distance, with the knowledge that politics had claimed what nature should have preserved. Still, she lived long enough to see him secure the throne, marry Elizabeth of York to unite the warring factions, and father children who would continue the dynasty. Among them Henry VIII, whose reign would transform England forever. Margaret herself died in 1509, only days after her grandson was crowned, her life a testament to endurance, suffering, and ambition wielded with unmatched patience. Upon her tomb in Westminster Abbey, carved in black marble, one can read the Latin words that honor her piety and her achievements. But no inscription can capture the screams of a 13-year-old girl in Pembroke Castle, nor the unrelenting devotion that carried her through decades of hardship to the pinnacle of power. Her story is not merely that of a noblewoman or a mother, but of survival against forces that sought to erase her. She endured forced marriages, widowhood, political suspicion, and the near loss of her own life, yet she transformed her suffering into the steel of ambition. In her, we see how history is sometimes shaped not by the warriors who swing swords upon the battlefield, but by the quiet resolve of those who endure, who scheme, who sacrifice everything for a vision they will not live to see fully realized. Lady Margaret Beaufort, pregnant at 13, broken in body but unbroken in spirit, became the founder of the Tudor dynasty, and through her pain, England was remade. And if you, like Margaret, believe that the forgotten agonies of the past deserve to be remembered, if you believe that history's hidden voices should not be lost in silence, then I invite you to carry this story forward. Like this video so that others may hear it. Share it so that these truths travel further than stone walls and tomb inscriptions. And subscribe to this channel so together we can continue to uncover the shadows of history. For only by remembering the pain that built our world can we truly understand the cost of the crowns and kingdoms that shaped it.